Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel about tech-driven solutions for retrofitting. I'm Aaliyah Pollock, and I work at the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, also known as RICS, and my role here involves analysing the impacts of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And as part of that, I run the RICS Tech Partner Programme, which some of you may be aware of. And what that is it's a community for producing thought leadership content and insights aimed at the surveying profession. Here at RICS, we have a huge focus around fields of real estate and sustainability. And today's discussion on retrofitting is a perfect example of how these two areas intersect. Retrofitting is very important for us as it plays a role in enhancing the sustainability of our built environment. And as we strive towards a net zero future, understanding and implementing effective retrofit strategies is essential. This aligns very closely with our focus on the whole life carbon assessment, a key tool for managing and reducing carbon emissions throughout a building's life cycle. Our whole life carbon assessment standard is designed to provide consistent and accurate carbon measurements, helping us to manage carbon budgets, reduce life cycle emissions, and deliver on our sustainability goals. Today's discussion will focus on how technology is reshaping retrofitting, the challenges we face, and the tangible outcomes of successful retrofit projects. We'll be exploring the evolving landscape of retrofitting, including how technology adoption is progressing and what barriers are still in our way. Now, I'm very excited to introduce our panelists, so without further ado, let's get started. Lisa, I'll jump across to you to kickstart.
So my name is Lisa Cairns. I work for IRT, which is part of the Mears Group. I'm Business Development Manager, and we specialise in a data software platform that models homes for retrofit. Our main clients are housing associations and local authorities, and we also thermally survey these properties too.
Evan, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks. Pleasure to be here on this esteemed panel. So my name is Evan Petkov. I've been a sustainable buildings engineer for a long time and recently a software entrepreneur. So I'm the CEO of Optiml. We are a ETH Zurich spinoff. We have been operational for 2 years now and are just raised our seed round. We build software to solve the decision-making process in real estate, importantly combining the financial, engineering, and sustainability elements. So trying to upgrade the decision-making process for portfolio and asset managers, but also consultancies to move away from static reports and make decisions much more data-driven. So we're now live in the German-speaking region, also the UK, getting clients there, and we're hiring. So with that, hand it off to Hermione.
Thanks very much, Evan, and thanks, Aaliyah, for inviting me to this really interesting panel. So I'm Hermoine Crease. I'm the CEO of Purrmetrix. We build data collection tools and software that measure housing performance at an individual home level. So our focus is very much on looking at the actual performance of each home and understanding how retrofit will impact upon this. This is quite widely used by social housing landlords who are interested in benchmarking housing performance, both before and after measures are applied to homes.
And thanks, Hermione. Moving across to Josephine.
Hi, thanks, Aaliyah. Yeah, I'm the COO and co-founder of MapMortar. We're a virtual modelling and simulation platform to help sustainability leaders and professionals plan and manage decarbonisation across their estates. So we work with commercial landlords. We're asset type agnostic. At the moment, we're running pilots with a few of the great estates in London. We've just closed our fundraising round, which is exciting, and we're really hoping to work with more commercial landlords in cities outside of London as well.
Now, thank you very much for the introductions, and let's get started. So in recent years, the retrofitting sector has seen significant shifts, particularly in how technology is being integrated. These changes are reshaping the industry and influencing the way projects are approached and executed. So I'd like to start by discussing some of the changes you've observed and how they're impacting the adoption of new technologies. So Lisa, I'll start with you. Looking at the past 2 years, what significant changes have you observed in the sector? And how are these changes impacting your approach to developing technology solutions?
Good question. I would say in the last 2 years, we've seen significant changes politically. A lot of changes as well around, I suppose, how the strategic targets that housing associations and local authorities are putting in place now. So I think there's more knowledge in the market of what those targets should be. But I would say from a tech point of view, the biggest thing we've had to do in the last 2 years is offer a lot more support to our customers in terms of the data analysis side of things. So I think as tech and software gets more advanced, we sometimes can be guilty of leaving our customers behind a bit. So we have found that in terms of the support around, technically understanding the software and the benefits of that software can bring, has been pretty crucial in our model going forward. So I would say last 2 years, definitely everyone is making data-driven decisions, but the sector has a real lack of resource in that area as well. So we've had to really ramp up that in terms of customer support, just taking it that step further and just always being there to kind of guide, how to use the software, how to get the most out of the software, and what is the benefits of it.
And thank you. So you've just mentioned how over the past 2 years, organisations are increasingly adopting technology. But Hermione, I'll move across to you. Where do you see the industry currently in terms of adopting technology for retrofitting? Is it on par with other sectors?
Well, that's a really nice build on what Lisa was just saying, because both Lisa and I work a lot in housing and in volume sort of housing deployments, and we see exactly the same thing, that technology, there's a much wider adoption of technology and acknowledgement that data has a very crucial role to play in steering retrofit policies. The challenge, I think, is that it's not quite yet business as usual in terms of the processes that they follow. So people are on a very steep learning curve about exactly what it is that they're trying to get out of the data that they're measuring. And the housing sector is beginning to adopt these projects, but I think we've still got a few years yet before there's a sort of standardized approach to this. Against the context where you see with new government coming in, new policies being considered, particularly around things like how targets are set for energy efficiency, then there may well be, there's a danger that all the learning that we do has to be redone in the context of a different, say, EPC assessment model that might be coming up.
So continuing on that topic, Evan, I'll move across to you. What would you say are some innovative policies that can accelerate deep retrofits?
Yeah, I think following up on the previous points, what's important to note about the building sector is, maybe a controversial statement, but largely we have the technologies we need to decarbonize. It's a question of deployment. So costs are decreasing rapidly for heat pumps, solar batteries, etc. We have them, they work. It's a question of how to interconnect them in the smartest way. And I think that is what's coming up both in the market, but also policies, is because of the increasing complexity of renewable energy technologies. For example, the interconnection between renewable energy systems, heating, cooling, and ventilation, we need to think smarter and more integrated. So both engineering companies are challenged to design those things, but also real estate owners are challenged to actually evaluate if they're the right things to do. It's slowly starting to pick up because they are noticing that they can reduce CO2 faster and that the ROI is more positive. In terms of the policy side, though, there are, of course, incentive schemes that are promoting more integrated systems instead of piecemeal retrofits, which is very important as a general progress for the industry.
Evan, continuing on, how do you see this continuing in the next 2 years with recent changes in the UK?
So you asked me the UK politics question. Nice. So I would, I would definitely hand it off to you guys to answer that a little better. I'm less connected, but I can answer in the EU is they are essentially trying to form something like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, with the new steps of the EU taxonomy. They call it part of that for buildings is the Energy Performance Building Directive recast, where there will be essentially increased requirements for buildings, like they have to reach a certain EPC level, but also incentive schemes, such as what I mentioned before. But with that, I'll hand it off to the Brits here to comment on that.
Yeah, if I can jump in a little bit if that's helpful. Actually, I think in terms of housing retrofit, there's a reasonable degree of stability between the last administration and current guys who have just announced that they are going to continue supporting a warm homes policy that should cover 5 million homes with about 6 billion quid's worth of funding over the next 3 years. Now the devil's in the detail, and we haven't necessarily seen the detail prioritized, so we wait to see what's going on there. Where, for example, where the detail really gets interesting is exactly how that delivery is going to be measured and evaluated. That's really the role of data. Yet at the moment, the only game in town appears to be EPC grades, and EPC grades have some shortcomings for really efficient deployment and modelling out of what retrofit measures should be applied to assets.
So touching on that point about incentives, Hermione, I'll move across to you. I think it's very important to talk about the driving forces of retrofitting. How do market forces influence the decision to uptake retrofit projects?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting one, and a very different game for for commercial buildings. I'll let Josephine speak a bit to that sort of conversation. In housing, and particularly in this sort of marketplace where you've got landlords who are doing the retrofit on behalf of tenants, then the commercial argument is largely built around either the regulator is asking us to do it, there's funding available for it, we see that there will be an improvement in the valuation of our assets if we do it, and finally there is some evidence that we will have lower ongoing costs associated with maintenance and arrears if we retrofit our housing. So these get cobbled together in a business case for retrofit at the asset level, but it still is the case that generally it's much easiest to do where you have a funding call available and some third-party support if you happen to be a social housing landlord.
So continuing on that point, Josephine, what are some examples of government regulations that act as sticks to push for retrofits? And how do these compare in effectiveness to market-driven incentives?
Yeah, very good question. So kind of following on from Hermione's points, the incentives for, let's say, commercial asset owners, so office, retail, so on spaces are very different for asset owners who have residential spaces largely. And that obviously includes kind of owner occupied as well. If you're a homeowner, decarbonising your house is very different than if you own an office block that you're trying to rent out to tenants. So sticks, the only real stick I think at the moment is EPC. I mean, the stick itself is called MEES, so the Minimum Energy Efficiency Standard, and that relates to the EPC rating. So at the moment for commercial buildings or non-domestic, the MEES, minimum energy efficiency, is to really reach EPC B by 2030 and EPC C by 2027 as an intermediary target. We had a similar target for residential, which was scrapped by the past government, and that was EPC C by 2025 for residential for privately rented buildings. And I think scrapping that basically scraps the only incentive for buy-to-let landlords or residential properties which are rented out from changing, because that was already quite a loose incentive. There was something called a payback period in that, which essentially was sort of like a get out of jail free card for a lot of landlords that said if they can't make back the investment that they put into upgrading the properties in 7 years through rental income or whatever that might be, then they're excluded from that target essentially, which is a pretty kind of myopic way to view how the benefits of decarbonisation not only from a like, okay, you increasing rental value or the value of the asset, which is essentially what that policy was saying, but are you actually making, you know, your tenants' lives healthier and so on. So yeah, I think there does need to be more sticks, I think, and for residential specifically, and I think it just comes down to the basics of that asset. Like, people need somewhere to live. It's a basic physiological requirement, in the same way people need to eat and people need to drink clean water. People don't need to rent out an office space in the same way. So you're always going to get a different incentive. And I would say, to be honest, from the non-domestic side of things, so for very, very clearly retail office, there's a much larger incentive from a market perspective of those assets just not being as valuable to the tenants as they once were. I mean, retail's been in decline for years, and that's due online shopping, e-commerce, all those kind of things. People don't need to go to a shop. They want to go to a shop, which is a very different incentive. And it's very similar to offices post-pandemic as well. Vacancy rates are still not where they were pre-pandemic. And we're seeing the market being that driving incentive, sticking in a lot of ways to office spaces to upgrade, make it more appealing to commercial tenants that want to rent out of those spaces. I am a proponent of like more stricter sticks, if you will, from a regulatory perspective. Obviously, they need to make sense for everyone involved, but certainly for residential, maybe it's a bit of a cynical view, but I don't feel like things will change without those stricter sticks and incentives from a government regulatory perspective.
Well, given the recent governmental changes in the UK, how do you see these sticks and incentives changing over the next few years, for example?
Yeah, I mean, Labour as a party has been more openly vocal about kind of climate change, especially with the new with Ed Miliband as the head of kind of climate change and net zero. So I think that I suspect more stricter regulation will come in, but you would hope that they would off balance that with making it easier to make changes to properties. So the classic one is kind of the planning reform, which has been proposed at the moment, where if you need to make a deeper retrofit or you make any change to a property, there's much less kind of red tape in order for you to do that. I think that would be critical. And you would hope as well that there would be more funding available for those who need it. And that should be, and again, I think that it seems like this government are taking a kind of longer term view on the benefits of decarbonisation when it comes to things like, okay, yes, we need to protect our environment and our world, but also we could get a huge bonus from energy security as well, and having localized energy rather than relying on other countries for oil and gas. So I think in that way you could see potentially something really progressive around seeing buildings as a key source for producing energy and involving that in a lot of retrofit properties as well. So not just like, how do we make these properties more energy efficient, but how can we take advantage of, say, virtual power plants or microgrids or all these kind of really exciting things, which would be really, really transformational. And you have a huge amount of benefits as well that are not just purely like, do this, otherwise you'll get fined, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. One point I did want to mention, Lisa and Evan, and maybe Hermione as well, it's this key word around data. And I think I just want to go around the table and ask you all a question, and it's, how important is the role of data in ensuring the success of a retrofit project? So Lisa, I'll start with you, and we'll go around the table.
I think in my experience, when I've seen data being used in retrofit projects, there's been a variety of levels of accuracy of that data. You know, most people are modelling on those SAP scores because that's the kind of model everyone's using, and it's just to stay consistent and try and standardise that process a bit. But we can't just rely on that. I think even just things like the additional surveys and, you know, the survey strategies that are now coming into place for that retrofit solution as well, all of the data from that needs to be fed back into the same place as well. So I think things have changed quite a bit, that maybe just a few years ago we were just using that EPC data and we were modelling on that. I think now, from our experience, we're definitely taking, say, 4, 5, 6 different sources of data. So that could be from a housing management software, an external software provider, a surveyor, you know, even from our thermal surveys, we're converting that into metrics, pulling the metrics back into that data source as well. So yeah, I think people are now aware that they're having to take more data from different places and then do the modelling from there. It makes it more complex, of course, much more complex. And you do need that in-house resource to do that, but certainly it helps to make better decisions, I feel. And I think definitely when I speak to clients, they've made some mistakes on picking the wrong measures, putting the wrong technologies into the wrong buildings, into the wrong property types, not checking building fabric first before putting a certain technology in. And so I think those learnings have improved the process a lot, but it has resulted in a lot more data.
Yeah, I want to totally double down on that because I agree data validation is key, and there's so many the last years like simple scenario approaches. You know, consultants make variants based on significant assumptions of the building, and I've seen it actually take wrong decisions and increase CO2 in buildings, but also costs. So it's not that just software platforms need to improve, but the EPC schemes, including the SAP software, which is used in the UK, definitely needs an upgrade. And I think overall, let's be honest, we're stuck with the EPC and the methodologies because people understand it so well. We can try to change it from within, but it's always going to be this beast that we struggle with. And the only solution we have is to have other sources of truth, but then we're challenged for how to compare it, right?
Yeah.
Because it only goes down to a certain level of detail. I think another source of data that is often not considered, and actually back to the policy point of Josephine, is the local requirements and forecasting what could happen in the future, right? So very political points that are brought up in terms of you know, increasing regulation versus using market dynamics such as CO2 taxes, how they might change, and this sort of modeling significantly affects what is the optimal or the smartest retrofit to do. But obviously it depends what future you believe in. A lot of people consider the status quo will continue forever and base all of their financial projections on that, but clearly that doesn't reflect the reality. As we've seen, gas prices have spiked, etc. And this sort of risk analysis relates to the data point. It's also critical that this is incorporated into retrofit programs.
Yeah, I think you raised a good point there, Evan, which is actually quite. I think it's interesting to consider what you mean by success in retrofit, because that critically impacts precisely what it is that you're trying to do with the data. And in housing in particular, you have a very, very, you have quite a significant overlap between measuring success as decarbonisation, measuring success as affordability, measuring success as health impacts in housing. Data is critical to understand each of those, but to Lisa's point, you can use a number of different data sources to try and model out what's going on there. But you're likely to find that some data sources are better for some decisions than for others. So you end up with a situation where, yes, data is important in evaluating retrofit success, but I think the housing market is just beginning to get to grips with actually what precisely does success look like? What is it that we're trying to drive? What actions are we trying to drive here? And that's quite exciting, actually, because there's an enormous amount we can do with developing better data delivery tools and better data evaluation tools when we understand precisely what it is that we're trying to get at. And to your point about EPCs, Evan, I totally agree. They are, it's great that they're there. It's terrific that we've got this framework that essentially provides us with some degree of insight into 60 or 70% of the housing stock in the UK. Whether they're actually, whether the numbers on them are helpful for making the decisions that people want to make right now, that's a very arguable point. But they're there, and we can have that conversation about how we change EPCs to work better for those retrofit decisions that we need to make. So how important is data in evaluating retrofit success? It's really important. But actually, what do you mean by success? What are you trying to get done? I guess that's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, that's probably one of the main points, definitely. It's like, what is a successful retrofit? And
Yeah.
You could sit down with clients and say, what's your targets? And they'll be uncertain how to answer that question, because lowering carbon is a completely different target to, say, lowering costs for tenants. So yeah, they have to be quite clear on what their intention is before embarking on any retrofit project. Like, what's my intention here, and how do you monitor the success of that retrofit as well? You know, we don't really hear that much about the monitoring of data afterwards. You know, we're trying to really tighten up on that process quite a bit. You know, with MERS, is like, as soon as that retrofit is done, that we're starting to feed back into that data the new results of how that building's performing, and then how does that perform for the next few years, and then how do we evidence that that's been a successful retrofit. So that's quite fuzzy when you ask anyone about how the ongoing monitoring of that retrofit has been.
That post-works retrofit is really, it's, you know, post-works measurement, from the perspective of anybody like IRT who are trying to deliver good, solid models, forecasting models, you know, that's, I would have thought, really useful for refining the models that you're delivering, and for actually understanding the impact of individual measures. And if we don't understand the impact of individual measures, how are we going to understand precisely what's best suited to each individual scenario? It's, you know, I really hope people aren't skimping on that.
Yeah, I wonder if you guys have a similar, just a quick point from my side, but a similar situation as we notice a lot of building performance gap issues that a modeled retrofit at least 20–30% less, especially in residential, that we see that's not as bankable, and it's not necessarily the issue of the engineering company or the developer. It's just different use types, you know, the classic people opening windows in winter stuff. I haven't really found the best solution around this, right? Working with commercial owners.
I was just going to jump in on that, because I think you're absolutely right, Evan. And I don't know, I think I'm just like what Hermione was talking about in terms of essentially data is one thing, but defining success, or what's the frameworks we're using for that data, is like almost the more important thing. And I think, like, picking up on your point, Evan, people seem to get hung up on kind of the details, which really take away, like, they can't see the woods for the trees almost. So, like, yes, there's a performance gap, but taking a step back, is that performance so much better than the baseline? Well, yeah, it is. So do we really care about performance gap? I don't know. Like, are we using the right metrics to measure that as success? Nobody can expect 100% perfect outputs, but everything has to be relative to the starting point, which is 9 times out of 10 much worse than any measures which we're taking to improve that. So yeah, I think having that right framework for success in place, that should lead the data rather than kind of the other way around, if that makes sense.
The performance gap is a very interesting one, though, because it's tempting to ascribe nearly all of it to behavioural piece. And certainly in housing, one of the key things that we as an industry are working on, and particularly in Purrmetrix we're working on, is trying to do measurements that account for the behavioural piece, or at least highlight the behavioural piece. But you know, what it really emphasises is how much variability there is in how people use homes that have been retrofitted. So if you look at a population of homes that, you know, we're measuring post-works, then you may well see a distinct population of people who are seeing no reduction in their bills because they are taking warmer temperatures, versus people who are definitely seeing a reduction in their bills and living with the existing temperatures that they had before. And depending on how you're defining success in your retrofit, one of those cohorts could look like a failure to you. So it's, you know, these are things that you need to feed back into the model in terms of, if I'm modeling 100 different homes, allow for the fact that maybe some of them are going to go in a different direction just because of behavioural attributes in them.
There's loads of discussions around that behavioural monitoring, isn't there? And linking that with the tenant engagement piece of work that a lot of housing associations are trying to do prior to, like, even looking at properties for retrofit. We've been in loads of discussions around that, you know, even just using the thermal images, like how do we convert things like kilowatt hours into something that's actually understandable. Like, who knows what a kilowatt hour is, you know, that type of thing. So at every conference you go to, it's all around tenant engagement. It's all about education. It's all about how do people heat their homes, and how do they work the boilers, like really just simple things. And again, going back to that ongoing monitoring afterwards, you know, that there has been schemes where you've found that people start to ramp up the temperature in their homes and they start to use more electricity, and they're using their boilers more than they did before. And it can be just the simple thing that they think, well, this is renewable energy, we can use this, and you know, it's a completely different area, and it has its own analysis, doesn't it? So not to go too much into that side of things, but definitely tenant engagement and converting data into something that's useful for that piece of work is really crucial as well.
Well, Lisa, you've actually just jumped onto the question that was the topic I was going to move next on to. So it's exploring the challenges that are posed to tech companies, property developers, and the whole industry in general when implementing retrofit solutions, particularly in sectors like social housing. And I think with the changing regulatory landscape, these challenges can be quite varied. So Lisa, moving back onto you, you may have touched on some of these points, but what unique challenges do tech companies face when providing retrofit solutions specifically for the social housing sector?
I think, in my experience, you need to be really careful that your data software solution doesn't get too technical, that your customer, your client, can't use it. From my experience, if it does get too technical and they can't use it and your users start to drop off, then they start to need that additional support in terms of analysing the data and converting the data into something useful. You're then causing them to need extra resource, and you're actually costing them more money in the long run. So sometimes you can go down the wrong route of developing something too far and leaving behind your customer. I think I kind of mentioned that as a main point before. It's definitely something every tech company, I think, has to be really, really careful of. So the challenges, because the landscape's changing all the time for that sector, I think you've just really got to keep really tight contact with your clients and your customers and understand what their challenge is. Is it resource? Is it tenant engagement? Is it budget? Is it even just the process of applying for funding? You know, just knowing what that is all the way through. You can't really do that piece of work of like a market analysis piece of work and then for the next year develop something. You've got to just consistently be in contact with that customer. It changes so dramatically. You've just got to stay up to date, I think, with the challenges your customers have. That helps with your product development roadmap.
Yeah, so Hermione, moving on to you, continuing with the sector of social housing, what lessons are there to be learned from retrofitting social housing for other sectors?
That's a good question. I think I would refer back to a lot of the things that we said up the top about understanding a bit about what your specific goals are from the retrofit, and whether these are, and I'm not saying you can only have to have one set of goals, but you know, what's the trade-off between decarbonisation versus the impact on the cost footprint versus maybe even embodied carbon. So just have an awareness of what are the primary things that you're trying to accomplish, because that will tell you a great deal about how you then need to go about measuring it. One of the things that's really quite tricky, and I think this is across the built, across the built environment, is that lots of particular specialisms within the built environment have measurements that are basically expressed in a particular way. So I don't know, air changes per hour versus infiltration rates, and translating between the two is really kind of challenging. So if you have an understanding that your interest is in priority the decarbonisation, actually what are the numbers that you're going to use to steer that? What's your guiding star in terms of how you're measuring that success? Is it EPC rating? Is it tons of carbon displaced? If so, how are you dealing with it over the long term? it's worth having a little bit of clarity about that before you start to get into the complexities of managing the project.
Okay, Evan, we'll change the topic a bit here. What would you say are the real transaction risks that real estate companies are facing today?
Transaction risks. Yeah, I mean, a big topic is the stranding events, which is kind of a nebulous concept that's been adopted recently without a clear definition, depending who you ask. Some refer to it as the crème stranding, which is like subject to a top-down decarbonization pathway for each country and use type. Personally, I'm kind of critical of this because every building is a snowflake, and I think aligning it to a crème isn't necessarily a accurate potential analysis, so I prefer not to focus on that. So for them, the risks are really about rentability. I mean, what you see in inner cities like London, I think most of you are there right now. The long-term correlation between rental increases and vacancy has broken, and especially prime offices, which is the first signs of the green premium happening. That's data from the last year. So actually office prime rents are increasing while overall office rents vacancy are increasing. This is quite new. Nevertheless, quartile 2 office rents are still decreasing. So that still exists. But what that's showing is the market is willing to pay for higher value, deeper retrofitted buildings that are higher quality, right? So that's a really cool beginning sign. Nevertheless, those are usually higher rents, which then you get into the affordability questions. So in terms of transaction risks is, our clients specifically, they really need to see how the projected rental forecast could happen in a certain city. If they're confident in that, they are willing to put in more green capex into that building, which achieves the goals. But nevertheless, unfortunately, I still think that's largely on prime properties for the time being.
So continuing on this topic of investments, Josephine, I'll move across to you. What are the biggest hurdles you personally face when justifying retrofit investments to stakeholders? And how do you communicate the financial and non-financial benefits of retrofitting to potential investors?
Yeah, so I think Evan was kind of talking on that point and kind of mentioning the elephant in the room. It's not really an elephant in the room, actually. It's like the person behind the scenes as it comes for commercial buildings, which is ultimately, although property owners might seem like the final boss in a way, but it's the financiers that are the ones that they have to please, if that makes sense. So that could be like massive pension funds, which ultimately own a lot of property, or private equity or REITs or all those kind of thing that ultimately trickles down and really influences how those properties are maintained and bought and sold as well. So basically the kind of the influences that we kind of try and talk about with our customers is, first of all, kind of understanding risk, because risk ultimately has a kind of financial element to it when it comes to commercial property. So basically just trying to make it super clear that by choosing to not retrofit, that is still making a decision. It's not like this, you're keeping the status quo, if that makes sense. And Evan touched on this as well, like things aren't going to remain the same, unfortunately, because the climate isn't going to remain the same. So basically trying to make people aware of not retrofitting has a financial cost to it, and we can very easily model that and show that. So that first of all kind of makes people aware of, okay, I'm spending money or I'm wasting money by not retrofitting. So that completely changes perspective. And then basically giving them, again, we've talked about frameworks a lot, but I think kind of they already have a certain framework when it comes to rental income, service charge, value appreciation of the assets, all this kind of stuff. And essentially including sustainability into this framework and retrofitting into this framework, which already exists in the way that they make financial decisions, has been really key for us as well. So a property owner will, for example, just think of maintenance costs as like a line item on their spreadsheet, and they won't really worry about it too much. And I think trying to kind of position retrofitting within that maintenance cost, this is just standard, this is what you have to do to properties. It's not like this additional scary thing that you can ignore, because I kind of really changed the conversation and removed those barriers. And I think interestingly, I was at an Innovate UK event when it was talking about that kind of mindset shift a little bit when it comes to sort of like owner occupied, so homeowners, when they use a statistic where they said, 3 million properties every year undergo kitchen and bathroom refurbishments. So it's not like people are unwilling to handle disruption in their home or property, or they're not willing to spend money on the property. Of course they are, but it's through what lens they see that disruption, which then comes into the value add piece, which I think is so missed often with retrofit conversations, that you're adding value, and green premium we've talked about already, but again, just giving people that full picture of what a retrofit does to the property really, really helps to reframe retrofit and kind of get over those initial challenges or prejudices that people might have.
Okay, so now that we've discussed some of the processes and touched on some of the challenges of retrofitting, let's shift our focus to the outcomes once this retrofit has taken place. Ultimately, the success of any project is measured by the tangible benefits that it brings, not only in terms of energy efficiency, but also in property value, sustainability, and overall impact. So, Hermione, I'll start off with you. Looking back at your completed retrofit projects, how would you determine if they were truly successful? Now, I know that this is a complex area, but how would you determine if they were truly successful, and what metrics or outcomes do you consider the most important when evaluating the overall success?
Yeah, so this is a really brilliant question for illustrating the sort of chain of different metrics that you might be thinking about, I guess. So let's take an example of a project we were doing with one of the London boroughs over the past couple of years. And the work that the measurements that we were taking were largely about understanding the fabric performance of these homes before and after, mostly fabric improvements. EWI, external wall insulation, was applied. And just the raw measurements of that look really good. Like, we're talking sort of 30% reductions in heat loss. We're talking 40 to 50% improvements in ventilation rates. So ventilation rates were more controlled. We're talking about homes that had previously severe condensation problems becoming unproblematic. But for some of those tenants, as I was saying earlier, their energy bills have gone up, and their energy bills have gone up against the context of, before the measures, they were living in homes where they were routinely getting to 12 or 14 degrees. That was how they lived, cold homes. Now they're living in homes that are 18 to 20 degrees. So for the tenants, that's probably seen as a success. For our customers there, what this all means is that these measures should be feeding into both an improvement in the value of the asset, but it should also be feeding into, for the most part, reduced bills for their tenants, so reduced arrears for their tenants, so lower levels of voids, and also lower levels of maintenance costs going forwards. I don't have the actual numbers, though, on what that means, because it's going to play out over the next 2 or 3 years. I understand precisely where those benefits are coming from. But I think that's a pretty good sort of ground up model of what you might look for from a housing retrofit and what success might look like.
Okay, so Lisa, moving across to you. In your experience, is there anything that you can do after a survey to assess the overall impact and sustainability of the project?
Yeah, there are a few things you can do. I think there's ongoing monitoring of the energy consumption in the building. A lot of success on these projects is based on that. How much are your tenants paying for their electricity after retrofit? Always going to be top priority. We do a lot of thermal surveys as well, just checking the quality of the workmanship on things like EWI installations. So we'll check if there's any heat loss, the quality of the workmanship, if there's any defects. That's always good as well. These installations can look great to the naked eye. So a survey like that has been really beneficial for a lot of clients. So there are quite a few things that you can do after the retrofit just to really prove that it has been successful.
I think it's important now to move across onto how retrofitting can impact a property's value. So, Josephine, I'll pose this question to you. How does retrofitting influence property values in the current market?
Yeah, so you can look at property values in a couple of ways. For a commercial owner, that is the asset itself appreciates in value. And then the other one is they can charge more rental income. So both of those things are starting to be called the green premium. Again, I think it's not a completely tight definition. There's not amazingly good data on this, but JLL has produced some stuff which says, you know, in some instances you might see an 11% uplift in value. So those are the kind of figures that people talk about now. From the residential, so homeowner side of things, you might see an uplift of around 7%. And again, you call that the green premium. I think with all of these things, it's really important to know. And again, I've touched on kind of maintenance and generally upkeep of the property. When you combine a retrofit with like an aesthetic uplift as well, so you just make the property nicer and you see it through that lens, like we're going to improve the insulation of this property, and whilst we're there, we're going to touch up the walls with some nice, you know, a fresh lick of paint and put some nice pictures up or something. Yeah, suddenly you will see that uplift in property because people just think it looks nicer. And obviously, like renting out a property or buying a property is so much about an aesthetic choice as much as it is kind of, right, I need somewhere to live, or I need an office space. So I think, and again, like it's really, I don't want to like hang my hat on these figures at all because they're very, very early. This is a completely new thing of a green premium. Obviously location is going to be probably the most important thing in a way to property value, at least from a commercial perspective. But definitely I think that has been a really interesting, again, mindset shift that I've seen in people who've really taken advantage of the perspective of that green premium or increase in property value off the back of a retrofit.
Okay, moving on. Well, continuing on with this topic, Evan, how do market trends and buyer preferences impact the valuation of sustainable properties?
Yeah, good question. So following up on Josephine's point in terms of like starting from the commercial side, so a lot of large corporations that especially run offices or retail, they have internal sustainability guidelines that they've created, which sort of drives the type of properties they would rent out. So that's kind of a market pressure, adding to that green uplift, as Josephine called it, in the commercial sector. And they're essentially saying, okay, it has to be a certain level and I need it GRESB accredited or something like that. So in a way that is partly driving up rents. Nevertheless, I think there are a lot of properties which are still making a lot of money actually, and they aren't GRESB or sustainable approved. And there is what I'm seeing in the market is also the opposite effect. And I think it's important to talk about these controversial aspects of what's called brown spinning. So that means actually brown assets getting spun out of a GRESB accredited portfolio, which I have seen because the capex is too high to maintain the value to be sustainable. But then when they're not in a GRESB fund, they could pin lower capex and still cash cow. So this is starting to happen. I'm curious how the market will react to such things. Someone will take those properties most likely. They'll still be a successful business case, but at some point the government will step in and maybe like tying. I think a bit of the discussion, especially Josephine started, which got me excited, is like the question of regulation versus market dynamics. Call me American, but I'm definitely much more on the market dynamic side of things. I think that will allow us to decarbonize faster. It's not that I'm like supporting the huge pension funds, but I think the fundamental difference is if lower interest rates are given to somehow a definition of a green retrofit project, I would argue that could accelerate faster than the stick approach. But again, open for debate.
So, Lisa, moving across to you, how do you personally measure long-term environmental impact of a retrofit?
A successful retrofit for our clients, and like our clients are housing associations, local authorities, is one that they've spent that money wisely. Yeah. And obviously with the ultimate goal of having a warmer, healthier home and reduced costs for tenants. That's the priority, always a priority. But the next priority after that is that they've spent that money wisely. You know, it's government money, even if they're applying for funding, it's the same. You have to track every decision you've made on that retrofit journey, and you have to be able to say at the end of it, this is successful. The quality of the workmanship has been good. This has worked, and this is the outcomes. Our tenant is healthier, warmer, and we've got reduced energy costs there. So I would say that's what I would say is a successful retrofit for our clients. How we go about that is, again, that we will, apart from that initial modelling of those retrofit projects and saying these are the best measures for these homes, and these homes you could tap into these funding schemes. After that, it's the ongoing monitoring, of that project, and really what are the outcomes of that. The data that's fed in from the surveys after that retrofit work's been done. You know, we have seen a massive increase in the last year or two of us doing thermal surveys on, say, EWI installations, you know, checking the quality of the workmanship before anything's signed off. So there is massive increase in the actual quality of the installation now as well. So yeah, I think we're a lot tighter at monitoring and feeding back that information back to, let's say, like a software platform like ours, or just to feeding it back in that you can then plan your next retrofit project probably a lot sharper.
Okay, thanks. So just one final question to everyone. I mean, in the simplest of terms, what advice would you give to organisations or individuals considering a retrofit project in the near future? Evan, I'll start with you.
If you're a commercial landlord, try to avoid the trap of building by building energy audits and consider a more scalable approach.
Hermione?
I'd say probably blazingly obvious, but talk to, if you're a social housing landlord, get help from somebody who's been there already and has some evidence of success. So there's an awful lot of forums out there trying to helping people understand what's necessary.
Thank you. Josephine?
I would say, if you're starting a retrofit project, don't forget that not starting a retrofit project is still making a decision financially.
And last but not least, Lisa?
I would say take the time to get the right information about the true condition of that building before even modelling or attempting any kind of retrofit on it. I would say don't rely just on EPC data. Take as much information as you can from any source you can get it, and I would say survey the building fabric first as well.
So great. I think this conversation could definitely be continued, but today we've delved into how technology is transforming the process of retrofitting and the various challenges that come with it too. We've touched on the impact of evolving technologies, the obstacles to their adoption, and also how they can drive us towards more sustainable and efficient buildings. Retrofitting is essential, not for improving building performance, but also advancing our sustainability goals. By leveraging new technologies like the solutions provided by our panelists, we can enhance energy efficiency, reduce carbon footprints, and achieve greater resilience in our built environment. A special thanks to our panelists for their insightful contributions, and I look forward to continuing this discussion in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks,
guys.